You know, one of my favorite topics to dive into has always been stories about new houses. You know the kind. People move into a new home, all excited, and then stumble upon something, or someone, that really doesn't belong there. This story happened a few years back, but even now, thinking about it gives me chills. I've kept it to myself for a long time, but now that enough time has passed, I figure it's safe to share without causing any trouble. Back then, my wife, let's call her Emily, and I had just left the hustle and bustle of city life for a quieter life in the suburbs. We just had our third kid, and let me tell you, our little apartment had turned into chaos central. Between the baby gear, toys everywhere, and the never-ending noise, we were packed in like sardines. So, when we found a cozy house in a peaceful, family-friendly neighborhood, it felt like we'd hit the jackpot. The neighbors told us it was the kind of place where people didn't bother locking their doors. The house wasn't huge, but compared to the shoebox we'd been living in, it felt like a mansion. Emily was immediately drawn to the backyard, a quirky little space with an overgrown garden and a few old, weathered statues scattered around. Now, I'll be honest, the statues gave me mild Game of Thrones vibes. They were kind of creepy, worn down by years of rain and sun, but Emily loved them. She said they gave the yard character. I wasn't one to argue. I figured leaving them there was less work for me, so why not? A few days after we moved in, I was standing by the kitchen window, enjoying the view of the yard, when something caught my eye. One of the statues, an angel, I think, was facing away from the house. That struck me as odd because all the others were clearly turned toward us. I didn't remember it being like that, but I figured I must have been mistaken. The next morning, though, I glanced out the window again, and now a second statue had turned to face away from the house. This time, I was certain something wasn't right. I asked Emily if she noticed anything strange, but she just waved it off and said she hadn't. At first, I thought it might have been our oldest son, let's call him Danny. Danny had a knack for pulling pranks, and this seemed like the kind of harmless joke he'd play. But when I asked him about it, he gave me the most confused look, like I'd just asked him to explain calculus. I was starting to feel like I was losing it. I didn't want to sound paranoid, so I decided to brush it off. We had bigger things to worry about anyway. Money was tight, and the constant fear of losing my job was like a dark cloud hanging over us. For a few days, nothing else happened, and I started to convince myself it was all in my head. But one evening, just as the sun was setting, I glanced out the window again, and what I saw stopped me cold. Every single statue was lined up along the edge of the house, facing it. The sight was so eerie, it felt like I'd stumbled into the middle of some low-budget horror movie. The way they were positioned, it was almost like they were watching the house. My chest tightened, and my breath felt shallow. I wasn't sure if I was more scared or just plain freaked out. I decided to go outside and take a closer look, hoping there was some logical explanation for it all. But before I opened the back door, I found myself scanning the yard, my eyes darting nervously from one corner to the next. It was broad daylight, but my gut told me to be on edge, like someone might actually be out there watching me. Eventually, I managed to gather enough courage to step outside and take a closer look at those statues. I walked up to the nearest one and tried to lift it, only to realize something startling. It was incredibly heavy, far too heavy for one person to move on their own. I couldn't even budge it an inch. That realization sent a chill through me. As I stood there, trying to make sense of it all, my wife, Emily, came outside. The look on her face told me she was just as shaken as I was. She tried to offer an explanation, suggesting maybe one of the neighbors was playing some kind of twisted joke on us, trying to mess with the newcomers. But honestly, that didn't sit right with me. We met most of the neighbors by then, and they all seemed like regular, friendly folks. Besides, who in their right mind would pull something like this on a family with little kids? This wasn't a harmless prank, it felt like harassment. We decided to call the police. Predictably, they weren't able to do much. They suggested putting up security cameras, but the idea of shelling out money for that wasn't feasible for us at the time. I told them we'd consider it, but deep down, I hated the thought of turning our new home into a fortress. The cops left, and while I felt a tiny bit better, Emily was still visibly on edge. We made a conscious effort to shield the kids from what was happening. Call it denial or just good parenting, but we didn't want to scare them. For a couple of days, nothing else happened, and I started to believe that maybe the police presence had spooked whoever was behind it. I even let myself hope it was all over. But I couldn't fully relax. Every time I walked past the window, I'd find myself glancing outside, half expecting to see one of those statues moved again. Let me tell you, there's no worse feeling than not feeling safe in your own home. A few days went by uneventfully, and I was beginning to feel a little more at ease. The house was finally starting to feel like home. But of course, that sense of peace didn't last. It was a weekend. I can't remember if it was Saturday or Sunday, but the kids didn't have school, so it had to be one of those. After breakfast, we all went outside to play in the yard. That's when I saw it. Spray painted in huge black letters on the back of the house were the words "Go away." The sight of it nearly made me drop my youngest. My heart was racing as I quickly ushered the kids back inside and told Emily to keep them in the house. I don't know what came over me, but I stormed back outside, adrenaline surging, shouting into the yard, threatening whoever had done it. I don't consider myself a brave man, but in that moment, I was ready to fight. I searched the yard, checking every corner, but it was empty, no one was there. As I walked back to the house, my anger started to fade, replaced by fear. This wasn't just some silly prank anymore. Someone wanted to send a message, and they were escalating. I realized we might actually be in danger. The police came out again, took another report, and told me the same thing they had before. There wasn't much they could do. They suggested it might have been teenagers pulling a stupid stunt. I couldn't believe it. This was more than vandalism. It was a threat. I asked if they could leave an officer on our property, but they said they didn't have enough evidence to justify that kind of resource allocation. They promised to keep a patrol car in the area, but that felt like cold comfort. Emily was even more upset than I was, and I did my best to calm her down, assuring her we'd be fine, even though I was terrified. That night, I was standing in the kitchen when I suddenly heard Emily scream from the living room. I sprinted in, and she was standing by the window, pointing outside. When I looked, my stomach sank. There were 5 people standing in our backyard. Each of them was wearing these eerie white masks that completely covered their faces, and they weren't just standing still. They were moving, swaying in this strange, jerky rhythm, almost like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. We froze, too stunned to do anything. The sight was chilling, like something straight out of a nightmare. I had no idea what those masked people were trying to accomplish, but it was, without a doubt, the most unsettling thing I'd ever witnessed. The shock finally wore off, and I grabbed the largest kitchen knife we owned, gripping it so tightly my knuckles turned white. Practically yelling at Emily, I told her to call the police. While she fumbled with her phone, I charged out the back door like a man possessed, the knife in my hand. I screamed at the top of my lungs, hoping to scare them off. For a brief moment, adrenaline made me feel invincible, until I realized what I was actually doing. There were 5 of them, and I was alone. What if they were armed? The moment the thought crossed my mind, I panicked. I turned on my heel and bolted back inside, slamming the door behind me. Cowardly? Maybe. But the knife must have spooked them, because they immediately stopped their bizarre dancing, darting off into the garden and disappearing from view. I shouted to Emily to grab the kids and hide upstairs while I stayed by the back door, ready to defend our home if they tried to break in. By the time the police arrived, those people were long gone. The officers did a thorough sweep of the yard and surrounding area but didn't find a single trace of them. No footprints, no evidence, nothing. That was the breaking point for me. I didn't care how tight money was. I was done taking chances. The very next day, I went out and bought a set of security cameras, installing them myself to cover every possible angle. The incident left Emily shaken for weeks. She begged me to let us sell the house and move somewhere else, but I convinced her to give it one last chance. I promised her that if anything else happened, we'd pack up and leave, even if it ruined us financially. Thankfully, the cameras seemed to do the trick. Whoever those people were, they never came back, and life slowly returned to normal. Still, the memory of that night lingers, and the scariest part is that we never got any answers. To this day, we have no idea who they were, what they wanted, or why they targeted us. We lived in that house for years after, but recently, we decided it was time for a fresh start. Emily, well, let's call her Taylor, wanted to put some distance between us and her family. She'd never been particularly close to them, and I think the proximity made her uneasy. So, with no kids to worry about and her not working anymore, she was open to my suggestions for where to move. I'm an electrician by trade, so relocating isn't a big deal for me. We eventually settled on New Mexico, a rural area, quiet and isolated, just the way we like it. We've both been country people all our lives, so it wasn't much of a transition. About 3 months ago, we found a great deal on a house out in the middle of nowhere. It's honestly bigger than we need, especially since it's just the two of us and our black lab, Lola. But we figured the extra space might come in handy for hosting friends down the line, so we went for it. At first, everything seemed perfect. But then, a few weeks in, I started noticing something odd. The upstairs lights kept tripping the circuit, even though the rest of the house stayed powered. It only happened a couple of times, but being an electrician, I immediately knew what the problem was. I figured it was a simple load imbalance on the breaker, something I could easily fix when I had a spare moment. It wasn't urgent, so I didn't stress about it. Now, here's the thing, I hadn't really spent any time in the basement since we moved in. I didn't have a reason to. The only time I'd seen it was during the initial walkthrough with the realtor, and even then, I hadn't paid much attention. So, when I finally went down there to check out the breaker box, I wasn't sure what to expect. The basement was cluttered, more of a storage space than anything. Old furniture, boxes of random junk, it wasn't exactly inviting. Eventually, I found the main breaker and started diagnosing the issue. It only took about 10 minutes to pinpoint the imbalance, and I made a mental note to rewire it later when I had more time. As I was heading back upstairs, something stopped me. Curiosity, maybe? I figured since I was already down there, I might as well look around a bit more. After all, it was my house, and it felt strange not to know every corner of it. I started poking around, moving some boxes and furniture out of the way. Most of it was just old junk, nothing worth keeping. The idea of turning the basement into a usable space crossed my mind, but I quickly dismissed it. There was just too much clutter, and it would have been a massive project. Dealing with the clutter in the basement already felt like a hassle, so I almost turned back. But then something caught my eye. In the far corner, hidden behind a stack of dusty old wooden chairs, was a large metal door. And not just any door, this thing was strange. It had an industrial look to it, like something you'd expect to see in a high-security facility. The first thing I noticed was how much bigger it was than a typical door. It was taller, thicker, and definitely not something you'd find in a regular house. I walked over to get a closer look, and sure enough, it had the kind of build you'd associate with a walk-in safe or a reinforced panic room. My first thought was that it might be a storm shelter. But that didn't make sense. Why wouldn't the realtor mention something like that? Curious, I tried the handle. Nothing. It wouldn't budge. The door was locked tight. I rushed upstairs and dug through the drawer where we kept all the leftover keys from the previous owners. There were a ton of random keys, some for cabinets, others for doors we'd never even locked, but none of them worked. I must have gone through at least 15 keys before finally giving up. Later, I told Taylor about it. She was just as intrigued as I was, so we decided to track down the previous owners. Somehow, Taylor managed to get their contact information, and I made the call. That conversation changed everything. The moment they picked up, I could tell something was off. They spoke slowly, pausing after every question like they were carefully choosing their words, or maybe deciding what not to say. Looking back, I wish I'd recorded the call, but of course, hindsight's always 20/20. When I asked about the door, the wife went completely silent for a few seconds. Then, in a flat voice, she told me it was just a panic room, a safe space for tornadoes. Okay, I said. But it's locked. We can't use it without a key. After another long pause, she finally responded, claiming they'd lost the key and suggesting we just leave it alone. Her tone made my stomach drop. It wasn't just dismissive, it felt deliberate, like she was hiding something. The excuse didn't add up either. They'd left us a pile of random keys for things like a bathroom cabinet, but not for this giant, ominous door? The conversation ended quickly after that. They clearly didn't want to keep talking. Taylor tried to laugh it off, brushing it aside as me overthinking things. But I couldn't shake the bad feeling in my gut. Over the next few weeks, I found myself drawn to that door. I'd go downstairs and just stand there, staring at it, wondering what was on the other side. I tried every trick I knew from work to get it open, but the lock was rock solid. Eventually, I gave up, at least for a while. Then, 2 days ago, everything changed. Taylor finally convinced me to bring in a locksmith. He showed up, a no-nonsense guy, and I led him straight to the basement. He examined the door for a few minutes, then started working. About 30 minutes later, I went down to check on him. He looked up and said something that made my skin crawl. "This is an unusually complex lock for just a panic room." Those were his exact words. I started to worry he wouldn't be able to open it, but after another half hour, he finally cracked it. I wish he hadn't. The door swung open, revealing a room that left me speechless. The walls were covered in old black and white photographs, each one marked with strange symbols I didn't recognize. They looked hand-drawn, like something out of an occult book. In the center of the room was a chair, positioned to face one of the walls. It was eerily worn, as if someone had spent hours, maybe even days, sitting there, staring at nothing. In one corner was a small cot with rumpled blankets that smelled stale and unpleasant. The odor hit me immediately, and I realized the room hadn't been empty for long. Then I saw the trash. Empty chip bags, crushed water bottles, signs that someone had been living there recently. My stomach churned as the realization hit me. Someone had been staying down here. I didn't think the situation could get any worse. But of course it did. As I stood there trying to process everything, I noticed another door. It was smaller, tucked away in the far right corner, half hidden by shadows. The dim light barely illuminated it, but it was definitely there. I walked over and opened it cautiously. What I saw made my heart pound. It was a narrow staircase leading downward. The narrow staircase led to the cellar door outside the house. My stomach sank. How could I have been so clueless? I hadn't even thought to check the cellar door since we moved in. I just assumed it opened to the basement, and in all the months we'd lived here, I'd never bothered to open it. But now, the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Someone had been living in my house. Living in my house. At first, I stood there in stunned disbelief, but soon my confusion turned into pure terror. All those small, weird things that Taylor and I had noticed over the months suddenly started to make sense. Things would go missing, little stuff, like a tool or a piece of food, and I'd always chalked it up to Taylor being forgetful, which, to be fair, she sometimes was. But now I knew better. Someone had been living here the whole time, sneaking in and out through that cellar door. The thought looped in my head until I could barely think straight. Who were they? Why were they here? And what were they planning? I tried calling the previous owners again, desperate for answers, even contemplating threatening legal action, but they didn't pick up. Maybe they'd disconnected their number, or maybe they just didn't want to deal with the mess they left behind. Either way, I was furious. Taylor, on the other hand, was just plain scared. That night, I decided there was no way I was leaving that door accessible. I dragged some of the heaviest furniture I could find down to the basement, and barricaded the cellar door from the inside. Then I added a heavy-duty chain and padlocked it shut for good measure. There was no way anyone was sneaking back in. The police came by and filed a full report. They said they'd try to track down the previous owners and even promised to work with our realtor, who was horrified when we told her what happened. That brought us a little peace of mind, at least for a moment. That night, as Taylor and I were getting ready for bed, we heard it. A loud, heavy bang on the front door. Lola, our lab, sprang to her feet, barking like a maniac. Taylor and I froze, staring at each other in silence, listening. The banging stopped after a few minutes, but then we heard it again, this time, small rocks tapping against our bedroom window. Taylor clung to Lola while I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under the bed. She begged me not to, but I couldn't take it anymore. I had to see who was out there. I yanked the curtain away and peered out into the darkness. But there was nothing. Not a shadow, not a sound, just an empty yard staring back at me. Taylor insisted we call the police, but part of me wanted to handle it myself. I wanted whoever was out there to pay for what they were doing. I told her if anything else happened, I'd call the cops immediately. Then, from downstairs, we heard the sound of shattering glass. I bolted down the stairs, gripping the bat tightly, and made it to the kitchen just in time to see two figures darting away into the night. The kitchen window was completely destroyed, shards of glass scattered across the floor. I didn't hesitate this time. I called the police, who arrived quickly and searched the house and yard thoroughly. They even checked the basement and the storm room, but there was no sign of forced entry or anyone hiding on the property. The officers suggested that whoever had been living in the basement was likely furious about being locked out and decided to retaliate by scaring us. I felt a mix of anger and dread. This wasn't just some harmless prank, this was a deliberate act of intimidation. Taylor has been a wreck ever since. The police promised to escalate the case, especially now that there was a clear crime involved. They said they'd keep trying to contact the previous owners, but it might take a few days. That was 2 days ago, and we still haven't heard anything. I'm hoping the police presence scared off whoever was targeting us. So far, we haven't had any more incidents, but the thought that someone was living in my house without me knowing still keeps me up at night. If we can't get answers soon, I don't know what we'll do. I braced myself for the worst, but I hope it never comes to that. It's hard to believe this is even real. When I bought my first house years ago, I was only 27. I'd worked hard, saved every penny, and felt proud to finally own a home. Back then, moving in was a big adjustment. I'd lived with my parents my whole life up until then. Growing up, I lived in a house that was always alive with noise and energy. 3 siblings, 2 dogs, and my parents, it was never quiet. The place always felt full, almost chaotic, but it was home. When I moved into my first house at 27, the silence hit me the hardest. It wasn't just the absence of voices or barking dogs, it was the complete stillness. No creaking floors, no random bursts of laughter from the next room, just silence. It was unnerving at first. I'd come home from work, sit down, and feel like the walls were closing in. It took me weeks to adjust, and honestly, I don't think I ever fully did. If you've ever gone from a noisy family home to living alone, you'll know exactly what I mean. One thing I did love about the house, though, was this tiny balcony on the second floor. Now, calling it a balcony might be generous. It was barely big enough for me to stand on, and there was no way I could fit a chair out there. But it became my little escape. Most nights after work, I'd step out there to clear my head. I smoked back then, but I hated the smell lingering indoors, so the balcony was perfect. It felt like my own personal luxury. I could enjoy a cigarette without stepping outside or giving up the comfort of home. The layout of my street was pretty standard for suburban neighborhoods. My house backed directly onto another row of houses, separated by tall, 10-foot fences that divided each backyard. From my balcony, I could see over the fence into my backyard neighbor's property. Their entire yard was visible from my vantage point. After a few weeks, I realized I'd met almost all my neighbors, except the person living behind me. Actually, I wasn't even sure if anyone lived there. I'd never seen them, not even once. No waves, no small talk, nothing. The house was silent. I never saw anyone in the yard, and the bedroom windows stayed dark most of the time. If it weren't for the occasional flicker of a light at night, I would have thought the house was abandoned. The yard didn't help the mystery. It looked completely neglected, overgrown grass, weeds everywhere, and not a single sign of maintenance. I figured maybe an elderly person lived there, someone who couldn't keep up with the upkeep. Curiosity eventually got the better of me. One Saturday, I decided to walk around the block and introduce myself. At the very least, I wanted to see who was living there. When I arrived, the house looked even worse up close. Rough, didn't even begin to describe it. The paint was peeling off in chunks, parts of the siding were scratched or missing, and the front yard was a jungle of weeds and dead grass. The walkway was cracked and stained, and the doorbell was broken. I knocked loudly a few times and waited. Nothing. I felt awkward standing there, debating whether to knock again or just leave, when I noticed a flicker of movement behind the curtain. Someone was there. I could feel their eyes on me, but they weren't answering the door. That alone was enough to make me uneasy. I was about to turn and leave when suddenly the front door flew open. It slammed against the wall with such force that I jumped back in shock. Standing in the doorway was an older woman, maybe in her 70s. She was short, with her gray hair pulled back into a severe bun. Her skin was deeply lined with wrinkles, but her face looked tense, like she was clenching her jaw or flexing her muscles in an unnatural way. Her eyes, though, they were the most unsettling part. Wide and unblinking, they seemed to pierce right through me. I froze, completely caught off guard. Something about her felt off, like she was on something or just not entirely there. For a moment neither of us spoke. She simply stared at me, her face blank, her expression unreadable. Finally, I cleared my throat, trying to sound casual, and introduced myself as her new neighbor. Her response came after an uncomfortably long pause. "Priscilla," she said, her voice low and flat. She gave me a small, forced smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. That was it. She didn't ask my name, didn't make any effort to continue the conversation, she just stood there, staring at me like I was a puzzle she couldn't figure out. The whole interaction was unnerving, to say the least. I mumbled something about it being nice to meet her, nodded awkwardly, and turned to leave. As I walked away, I noticed she hadn't shut the door. I could feel her eyes on me the entire time, but I didn't dare look back. When I got home, I tried to shake the feeling, but something about that woman stuck with me. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew there was something deeply wrong with Priscilla. That night, I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling from meeting Priscilla and went out to my balcony as usual. I figured some fresh air and my usual routine would help me forget the strange interaction. I had no idea that I was stepping into a situation that would spiral out of control. As I leaned on the railing, letting my mind wander, I glanced toward her yard, and there she was. Priscilla. Standing dead center in her overgrown lawn, staring straight up at my house. She didn't move, didn't call out, just stood there, locked onto me with those unnervingly wide eyes. I froze. It was one of those moments where you question if what you're seeing is real. Should I wave? Say something? Or pretend I didn't notice her? Ultimately, I did what felt safest. I went back inside, telling myself she was just a lonely, eccentric old lady. She probably meant no harm, right? But it didn't stop there. The next night, I saw her again. This time, she was inside her house, moving from one window to the next, watching me through each one. I tried to act like I didn't see her, but deep down, I felt like she knew I knew. Even as I finished my cigarette and turned to go inside, I could feel her gaze burning into the back of my head. Out of morbid curiosity, I peeked through one of my windows about 20 minutes later. To my horror, she was still there, staring at my house. I called my dad that night, explaining what had been happening. He tried to reassure me, saying she was probably just confused, maybe dealing with dementia or loneliness. He even suggested I feel bad for her. I wanted to believe him, but it was hard to sympathize with someone who seemed to be stalking me. Still, his words helped calm me down, and I started to think maybe I was overreacting. For a few nights, everything was quiet. I didn't see her in her yard or at her windows, and I began to hope that whatever had been going on was over. But then one morning, I found something that sent a chill through me. In my yard, just on my side of the fence, was a single woman's sock. It was dirty and looked like it had been dropped there recently. I stared at it, my stomach knotting. She'd been in my yard. This wasn't just her staring at me from a distance anymore, she had crossed the line. I wanted to call the police right then and there, but I hesitated. I didn't want to escalate things or cause unnecessary drama with a neighbor, no matter how unhinged she seemed. That night, as I was lying in bed, the doorbell started ringing. Not once, not twice, but over and over, at least a dozen times in rapid succession. I didn't need to look to know it was her. At first, I was more annoyed than scared. In my tired haze, I threw on a shirt and decided to confront her. I'd had enough of her weird behavior, and it was time to set some boundaries. Looking back, I cringe at how casually I handled it. I didn't take her seriously, and that almost cost me dearly. The second I opened the door, she lunged at me. She came at me full speed, a kitchen knife in her hand, her face twisted in pure rage. She screamed, accusing me of taking her son from her. I barely had time to react. Instinct kicked in, and I grabbed her arm, wresting the knife out of her hand. My heart was pounding, my hands trembling as I managed to pin her to the ground. She was screaming the entire time, nonsensical things about her son, about killing me. At one point, she even tried to bite me. I held her down with everything I had, frantically calling the police. Those 5 minutes felt like an eternity. She thrashed and screamed, her voice echoing through the night, but I refused to let go until help arrived. When the police finally showed up, they restrained her and hauled her into one of their cruisers. She didn't stop screaming, even as they forced her into the car. I stood there, shaken to my core, watching as the chaos finally left my property. The officers assured me she'd be taken to a psychiatric facility for evaluation and treatment. They stayed for a while to make sure I was okay and explained that she likely suffered from severe mental illness. I never saw her again after that night. Even now, though, the memory haunts me. It's made me more cautious, more paranoid about the people around me. I ended up moving out less than a year later. I couldn't stay in that house after everything that happened. Some experiences stick with you forever, and this was definitely one of them. Like and subscribe to the channel.